Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this open news meeting, which will, I think, be probably dominated by one subject above all other, but let's see. It's great to see you all. I'm Matt Dancona, I'm an editor at Tortoise, and I'm joined by my colleague Liz Mosley, who'll be in the chat, and I would urge you all to join in and add your contributions and thoughts, because the whole purpose of this exercise is our weekly meeting where we try and open source the news agenda and find out what you're thinking about, what stories we should be pursuing, what angles on existing stories we should be pursuing, which is particularly relevant here in this case. Also, if you want to say something, please do click the participants button and then press raise hand, and I can actually see that you'd like to contribute and go to you as soon as I can. Obviously, this has been a very strange period in international news in the sense that it's been dominated not only by the news in one nation, but the medical history and prospects of one man, Donald Trump, who's still the leader of the free world, pending the result on November the 3rd in the US elections. And it's been an extraordinary few weeks in America generally, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the row over her prospective replacement's confirmation, then the extraordinary story in the New York Times about Trump only paying $750 on tax, Trump falling ill, and then the most extraordinary few days with him going to Walter Reed Hospital, and with a speed that I think I can't compare to anything I've ever seen in US politics or indeed politics anywhere else. The story moved immediately to whether anyone believed what they were being told about his health. And this is extraordinarily important in all sorts of ways, because as I think the character in The West Wing says, you know, when something along the lines of if the president blinks, the Dow Jones moves, and that's true. The president, however much we might dislike him or disapprove of him, wish that him was a her, is nonetheless a hugely significant person in the world, and his medical condition it moves mountains. And the principal fact about this story is we don't know much about it. As my colleague Chris Cook said in today's Sensemaker, it's the thing that everyone is writing most about, but it's also the thing about which it's hardest really to reach hard conclusions, because as any doctor will tell you, speculation about the clinical state of a patient without actually seeing them is almost impossible. Nonetheless, everyone is doing it. So I'd like to kick off by going to my fellow editor and colleague, David Taylor, who is one of the most experienced journalists in this country on the US, knows everything about Americana. Dave, are you there?
Yes, I am. How are you doing?
Okay, so now, Dave, you're going to have to be Yoda for us on this, because you do know all the important angles. And I think in the spirit of Tortoise trying to cut through the noise, let's try and sort of filter out some of the angles. I mean, the first is that there's a phenomenon in American presidential politics called the October surprise. First of all, can you talk about that a lot and then say whether it means anything?
Whether it means anything. Yeah, well, it's a fantastic phrase, isn't it? The October surprise. It was coined by Reagan's campaign manager, and it's come to mean an event that comes along and upends the election. And the question is, I suppose, do they ever move the needle? And I was just thinking about this. It's quite a quaint concept now. You know, you cannot imagine a news cycle where just one story can dominate for a month. And you know, if you think of the 2016 race and what happened in October, there were at least 3 surprises. You know, there was the Access Hollywood tape, the infamous tape of Trump bragging about grabbing women. And one of the most august readers of politics in the US, I remember tweeting after that saying, put a fork in it, this election is done. Because everyone was just bringing their critical faculties to bear on that they'd used in elections past, and judging that, you know, no one can survive such an egregious statement coming into the public domain. And then on the same day, Julian Assange started leaking Hillary's campaign emails. And then, you know, with about 10 days or so to go to the election, Jim Comey popped up and announced that the FBI was having another look at Hillary's emails. So the whole thing was just ebbing and flowing. And ultimately, you probably think Comey was the final surprise that really shifted that election.
Do you think it did actually have an impact, Dave?
Well, I think, I mean, you know, who can really tell? I mean, in
Sure.
the end, you know, that election was decided by a handful of tens of thousands of votes across 3 states. You know, it was such a razor thin margin that in the end you can't really be sure. You know, people talked about, you know, was it the fact that Hillary Clinton never visited Wisconsin? Did that do for her? You know, it probably didn't help. But there was, even if just a few thousand wavering Republicans who thought Trump was beyond the pale because of that Access Hollywood tape, were swayed the other way when suddenly Hillary's emails were back in play. You know, it would have had a shift.
I suppose the utility of that story, which of course turned out to be a non-story because the FBI cleared her of everything, was that it gelled very nicely with Trump's hashtag crooked Hillary attack, didn't it?
Yeah, and was easy to understand, I suppose. Yes, you're right. Yeah. And I mean, just to give you a flavour of some of the others from October's past, you know, there was some of them are deliberate. You know, so in '72, Kissinger, 8 days before the election, made a statement from the White House saying peace is at hand, and it was a promise to end the Vietnam War. Which didn't actually come about until 1975, but it worked for Nixon, it's felt.
And he was National Security Advisor then, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, exactly. So that was very orchestrated and deliberate. Some of them are quite unexpected and in the lap of the gods. You know, Obama had Superstorm Sandy, and he responded like a leader. You know, there he was, looking bipartisan with Chris Christie, the New Jersey governor, and it was again seen to be, it was all the right optics for a president, you know, just a few days out from an election. And you know, I suppose amongst the unknowable things about where we are this October is, you know, is this sort of you know, warlike, triumphant imagery of Trump returning from the battle going to play strongly with his base, or is the, you know, the kind of the visitation of coronavirus to the White House and, you know, the spread of it amongst senior Republican ranks going to play to the people who think that this just sums up the failure of leadership? So we can't really know. But what you can be fairly sure about, I think, is that COVID is really the last thing Trump wants to be talking about. You know, they want to be talking about, you know, his economic record, or they want to be talking about, you know, Biden being in the thrall of the left, but they certainly don't want to be talking about 200,000 dead and so on.
Do you? I mean, you know this country so well. The media moved straight into a sort of conspiratorial mode about information being withheld about his health, which may indeed be the case, who knows. But have you ever seen anything like this where, you know, less than 30 days out from a presidential election, conspiracy theory is kind of the lead subject?
It's so exhausting, isn't it? You know, you everybody on Twitter is a rune reader on a, you know, I mean, I fell down a rabbit hole at the weekend of, you know, people analysing and over-analysing Trump's reflection in the table on one of those pictures, and was it somehow not showing his hand in the right place on one of them, and therefore was it all confected? And you have to sort of step out of that, I think, sometimes, and just feel like these certainly are the conditions that we're existing in now, where everything's a conspiracy theory and is subject to kind of questions of whether there's a double bluff or a triple bluff going on, and is that what they want you to think after all, and did he plan this all along? Somebody sort of puts a pseudo prophetic tweet out into the ether in August, and it comes to pass in October, and everyone just thinks, well, that's Reddit sorted out for the next 18 months. We'll prove and disprove it time and time again. So I don't think it's helpful. I think sometimes, my own sometimes exhausted experience of running a news operation in the States in the Trump era was that you couldn't remember what you'd been reporting on Tuesday by the time you got to Friday, and so you sometimes feel it's actually helpful to step out of the stream, which is partly our raison d'etre, isn't it? It's what it says over the door at Tortoise, that we kind of eschew breaking news and try and go a bit deeper.
I mean, I think I want to come back to you, David. Just the last thing I want to ask at this point is that obviously, Trump has got to talk, can't avoid COVID, though he would have liked to. So he's framing the virus as something which Americans shouldn't be afraid of, that they can deal with implicitly by moral character, by strength. He's seeing it through strength. Whereas Biden has come back quite hard with, I paraphrase, but it was your fault that you caught it, Mr. President. So there's a sort of strength versus responsibility dialectic going on here, isn't there?
Yeah, that phrase from the debate, it was almost like an overlooked aside from Biden, where he said, he's a fool on this, when he talked about his response to COVID. And I think that will have landed with a lot of people. I think there are clearly millions of people who think there's been an absence of leadership, and the sort of marginalizing, the attempt to undermine the CDC and Dr. Fauci. I think with a lot of grown-ups, people see that for what it is, that it's deeply unhelpful. But it is sort of Trump's desire to project courage and leadership and strength at all times is all consuming, isn't it? And I mean that, have you ever seen a man jut his chin out to quite such a degree on that balcony last night? And the kind of pulling off of the mask, it's so theatrical. And I think for some people, they probably got 4th of July fireworks going off in their head just looking at it. It's really uplifting, isn't it?
Well, that's one word for it. I'd like to, another very experienced American hand and journalist, my colleague Mary P. Mills. Mary P., I don't know if you're there. Hello. Interesting, because obviously everyone is now speculating on target states and the impact thereon, and it looks like Biden is still well ahead. Of course, the kind of orthodoxy after 2016 was that it was the left behind and the people in the Rust Belt that won it. But I think you had a rather different and interesting take on sort of key demographic in this.
I think it was, the left behind in the Rust Belt. But as Dave was saying, and I was in America at the same time as Dave, I was on the West Coast and he was on the East Coast, and our paths crossed. Happy times, Dave. But the really surprising cohort that voted for Trump last time, given the grab 'em by the pussy video, the Access Hollywood video, was white women of all social demographics who voted for Trump at 54% last. And that I always found it incredibly surprising. And what is interesting is that I've seen a few articles saying, you know, if Biden wins this time, it will be thanks to those white women flipping. In Pennsylvania, Biden is leading Trump now among women by 23 points, which is one of the reasons Pennsylvania looks like it's working in his favor, which is particularly interesting. But one of the things I wanted to say, you know, because I saw someone in the comment earlier saying I'm just too stung by, I think it was Joshua saying, I'm too stung by polls and I just don't believe them anymore. And, you know, I think you're right, Joshua, not to believe them. As I read all of this stuff because but I take it all with a massive pinch of salt for two reasons. I think people lie in polls, and they lie a lot about Trump, and they change their mind in the ballot box. And I was telling Matt before that I have two anecdotes that sort of stick in my mind about that, which is that I was living in the Bay Area at the time, quite a liberal place, but in a sort of quite well-off, nice area. And there was no indication that anyone where I was living was a Trump supporter. There were no signs anywhere. You know, there was a lot of Clinton the day after the election, when suddenly it went up, you know, and it felt like people felt they could come out and say, yeah, actually, I was one of these people. And the other story that this story will stay with me forever, I think. And my colleague Dave will remember someone we worked with at the time called Maraith, who was in the New York office, and you know, it's the New Yorker, but I really remember her telling me this story afterwards, which was that her mother and her grandmother had gone to vote together to vote for the first mainstream party presidential, female presidential candidate. Big moment for women, break the glass ceiling, and who they hoped would be the first female president. And they left the ballot box, and it was only after the results came out that the grandmother admitted to the mother and Maraith that actually she voted for Trump, not Clinton. And so they, you know, the granddaughter and the mother really felt this was quite a significant thing, you know, that they were all in it together, and actually got into the ballot box, little cross for Trump. And I just think, you know, the polls have been consistent, but I'm not sleeping easy until the night.
No, understood. I mean, I think that's so interesting and important that one remembers that it wasn't as it were just a, you know, hillbilly elegy victory at all. To quote the title of that brilliant book. But Mary, do you think though that category of voter, this was, you know, before Charlottesville and before, you know, his response to BLM, his clear contempt continuing for women. His style as president, we were promised in 2016 that he would change, the office would change him, and it conspicuously hasn't. So, I mean, clearly it's speculation, but do you think that the taking that anecdote, that if it was this time, that the same result would happen?
Do you know what? I honestly don't know. I think not. I hope not. Biden, I flip between thinking he's a weak candidate. I thought the debate was weak. And at the same time, I sort of feel that perhaps he hasn't gone into the trap of talking about identity politics, which I think is a real turn-off for those Rust Belt voters that you're talking about. I'd like to think enough, you know, as Dave said, it was just a small number of voters in a small number of states. It only needs that number to go to the other side for it to be a Biden presidency. And so on balance, I would say yes, but I don't know for sure.
That's a very, you know, very wise.
Right. Someone privately sent me a message saying that they like this poster behind me, which, and this is an aside, but is it Nico? I hate it. It's an argument I have with my husband, and I hate the fact it's behind me in every single one of these things. It's my least favorite thing in the house, Nico, but thank you.
It's very nice. I wonder if Chris Chadwick's there. Chris, are you available to speak? Hi, Chris. Wonderful background. I was just interested, Chris, in your comments in the chat about not knowing whom to trust anymore, because I think that this is, you know, when one looks at again, to take a step back and look at the broader kind of environment in which Trump thrived. And Bannon always calls him, Steve Bannon, his former chief strategist, always calls Trump the imperfect instrument. I.e., of course, he's a hugely flawed and objectionable man, but he happens to be the right. He was, at least in 2016, the right candidate for an environment in which people were ceasing to trust mainstream media and taking their cue from social media more and more. And I wondered what you thought about that, because I took it from a comment in the chat that you think that things haven't really got better.
Well, I think it's not necessarily just to do with Trump, but I think it is a consequence of the world that we're now living in. That so much stuff is pumped out, and there are so many agendas of so many different people. It's very hard to, unless you've got a lot of time to dig deep, to be able to ascertain whether something that you read is, it's got any validity in it whatsoever. I mean, I have to say that my involvement with Tortoise came from exactly a desire to try and find people who were prepared to, write longer pieces that had been fact-checked. And even then, it's an imperfect world, but at least to espouse that you're trying to do that, and that you're trying to find the sense in all of that noise I think is becoming more and more difficult for the average person on the street, I think, to be able to ascertain whether there is any credibility in half of what you see or read, especially through social media, because every individual has now got the power of a newsroom of global significance.
And do you think that has an effect on democracy more broadly? I mean, it must do, I assume, but it's not just an issue about media consumption, is it?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's also a herd mentality, isn't it? What sometimes happens is the voice that gets, is kind of speaks loudest, is adopted by lots of people, because they just think that, well, if everybody thinks this, or if everybody's talking about it, then maybe that's important. And so, there's no way of giving substance anymore. In the past, you would, if you think about the old way of grading newspapers, it was based on, circulation. How many people were actually reading it? Because you knew that if half the population was reading what was in this newspaper, then probably influencing thinking. Because now, a Twitter can go viral overnight.
I'm wondering if Andrew Girdwood is there. Andrew, are you in the house?
I am.
Good to see you. How are you?
Oh, good.
Andrew, you've always got interesting insights on all this, and I'm wondering in particular. I mean, so much of this has to do with micro-targeting and a level of granularity of campaigning that I think we still haven't got our heads around, really. And I know you're very tech savvy. What do you make of it? And should we be as confident of the polling as we are?
I think we should be. The American situation is complicated, of course, by the whole equal states not having the same number of votes, but that's a gotcha once, right? And it's solved the next time round. So I'm pretty confident in it. I mean, I don't disagree that it's not over until it's over. And the American public is a strange beast, but I'm confident in it. I think what's the unknown is the American mainstream media. So I suspect social media is overblown. I suspect Russian influence is overblown. What seems to be, I'm leaning heavily on a lot of research that came out this week, last week. The Americans are more influenced by what mainstream media does and says. And Trump, as president this time round, is in a much stronger position to influence mainstream media. And therefore, I don't think we will be out of October surprises might last up until the final day, I guess.
Right. So, in other words, his very sort of his very exposure is not necessarily to his benefit.
No, I think he has a microphone up until the very last day, and he could do or say something that could swing at the very last minute.
But you're not, I mean, last time clearly there was an element of neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street digital targeting that most people missed. But what's interesting about what you're saying is, I think that you don't think that will overtake our general perception of the trajectory right now.
I don't think so. The knack is, can you do that targeting to get to journalists and other very big influencers? And that's much harder to do now than it was in 2016. You cannot even target by employer or by job title on Facebook anymore. Whereas, 5 years ago, I could easily run a campaign designed to put it under the nose of journalists. I can't do that now.
Thanks very much. Can I come to Gertej Sandhu now? Because, are you there, Gertej? I don't know if you're...
Yes, I am.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. You mentioned the Lincoln Project in the chat, right? And which I think is kind of further to what we were just discussing, a very important a sort of feature, not that the project itself will swing the election, but that it has, it represents a sort of steel on the side of those who want to get Trump out of office. Can you expand a little bit on that and what you think it might do?
Yeah, the Lincoln Project's interesting because some of the people who are running it had helped Newt Gingrich, had been Reaganites, had sort of worked across the most conservative campaigns and been campaign managers. Lots of them are from the old McCain runs for the presidency as well. And they sort of came together, and it was a form of the Never Trumpers. But what's fascinating about them is the speed at which they operate. They react to news. So yesterday, as Trump was standing on the White House when he'd returned, and there was movement, and you could see he was trying to breathe. They, within seconds had that in the video, had an overplay on it, had music playing over it, immediately pushing it out as a message about his weakness and how he's going to affect everyone, how he's going to kill America. And they go hard. I mean, there's no. They did an ad which was about the soldiers, and when you'd saying that Trump can't protect the American soldiers. There was one particular one they did recently, which pushed out on all social media. Was this thing when Trump had spoken about at a rally that, if I lose to Biden, you'll never see me again. I'll never be around again. And they took that whole thing and put at the end of it, this message is endorsed by the Biden campaign. It was yes, you'll never see him again. But what's fascinating about it, because I think this is going to play out in other elections and is going to get bigger and bigger. This is a small group of people. There's about 35 of them now, started about 5. I think it's Michael Steele, who's the ex-RNC chairperson, is now the chair of the Lincoln Project, and they are vicious. And their whole undercurrent, I sort of said it the same, is we go low so you don't have to. And their belief is that Democrats have always been soft. They're too nice. The left is, or the centre is often too left. And the Republicans have a knack of winning, and we can make you win. And the whole theory is we are Lincoln Republicans. We're Reagan Republicans. We're not Trumpites. There is no Trump Republican. And they've also gone at state level. So they've gone after Lindsey Graham. They've gone after a whole series of individuals there. But what strikes me about the stuff on social media is that there is more of a balance than there was in the last election. If you tie that with the news that came out of Cambridge Analytica, that there's a theory that suppressed 3 million votes, particularly black votes, in a campaign recently. So it was about trust and it was about suppression. And this is the opposite thing, which is we will hit hard, we'll hit quickly, we'll be brutal. We will do what Trump has done in his messaging in the same way against him. And I think it's from that, the New Yorker piece is really worth reading if people are interested.
I think the link is in the chat for those that want to chase it. Yeah. Thanks so much. I'd like to just sort of close the iris a little bit and go back to Trump, or rather his body, which is now fizzing with an industrial strength cocktail of medication. If I may call on my colleague Ella Hill to walk us through some of the long inventory of medications he's been administered. And Ella, if you can, tell us what they do, and also which of them are available more broadly. I mean, some are, I think, in trials here, some aren't. Some are already proving useful, some haven't got to the point where they're available, to the general patient.
So he's been given quite a lot of drugs, as you said. At the White House on Friday, he was given a big mixture, most notably one from a US biotech company called Regeneron. And that drug is an immune boosting cocktail of drugs that mimics the body's antibody response to COVID.
This is monoclonal, isn't it? Monoclonal
yes,
therapy.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's created, those monoclonal antibodies are isolated from the blood plasma of recovered patients. And in terms of where it's at in the UK, that is still in clinical trials, but in mid-September it was announced that the UK's recovery programme, which is this Oxford University trial led by them, but includes 176 hospitals. So it's being trialled by that programme and with patients in hospital. Another drug he took on Friday was Famotidine, which is a drug more usually prescribed for heartburn. And researchers believe that the way this might function is that it could be impeding this enzyme that the coronavirus needs to reproduce. This is being trialled in the US, but as far as I know, it's not being used in the NHS. When he was admitted to hospital on Friday, the president was given remdesivir, and this is a broad spectrum antiviral drug, and it was used as well for treating Ebola, but it didn't really work all that well. A US study found that patients who were treated with remdesivir had a shorter recovery time, but it wasn't really shown to reduce death rates. On Saturday is when Trump was given Dexamethasone, which is a steroid drug. And this one is being trialled on patients in the UK as well, as is remdesivir actually. And that, as my colleague Zav said in the news list, the use of this steroid kind of indicates that Trump had some pretty serious difficulties with his breathing, because the drug has been trialled in patients who had been ventilated and patients who were on oxygen, but it isn't effective for people who don't need support with their breathing.
So we can infer from the administration of dexamethasone, A, that Trump was having difficulty breathing, I think. I don't think that's too speculative. And B, it is steroidal. And I've read anecdotal accounts in the last few days from people who've had it, saying that one of the things that happens when you have it is you have a huge burst of energy. So it's quite plausible that he's feeling okay right now and able to carry out that rather surreal theatrical performance on the balcony. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he'll be feeling fantastic tomorrow. I mean, dexamethasone is a drug for people who are quite ill, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. It appears to be only, I mean, Zab is saying in the chat here that it's not given to people who are moderately ill because it suppresses the immune system. So probably in the background, his infection is being suppressed and it's just sort of continuing, or his immune system is being suppressed, but the infection is continuing.
Thanks very much. Actually, I'd like to go to Zav now. Zav, are you there?
Yeah, hello.
Zab, is there any? Did you want to add anything on the treatment side? Because one thing about it is it seems to me that it's quite likely that if Trump had got ill in March or April, we might be looking at a very different situation now. I mean, there has been, for all the problems, for all disasters, for all the shambles, there has been quite a dramatic, series of discoveries and progress in how to treat this disease. And the fact that he's able even to stand up, I just wonder if a man of his health and age and general lifestyle would have been able to do that in April.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly the mortality rates for ICU patients have gone down so in the UK by 10% in the past few months. And that's believed to be because there are better treatments, doctors seeing that there's kind of advantages to using dexamethasone, doctors knowing not necessarily to put someone on a ventilator as soon as they have struggle breathing. Obviously in Trump's case, I think one of the big things that helps him is he's in Walter Reed Medical Center, where he has, I think, 700 members of staff who I imagine are, pretty dedicated to looking after him. But there's no doubt that he's in a better position to survive now than in March. I think, as people should say, he's not out of the woods yet. I think he was almost certainly pumped full of steroids, kind of stabilized and allowed to get back to the White House, but he's obviously still being treated in the White House. And when they talk about COVID patients crashing, it's often 7 to 9 days into the illness. So even if he was diagnosed as early as Wednesday, that still gives us kind of quite a lot of space for him to kind of go downhill if his kind of body doesn't react well to the treatment he's getting. I just wanted to add one other thing on masks, just because I think it's probably an interesting thing to add to the discussion. Obviously, the spectacle yesterday was Trump ripping off his mask, and I came across a very good Economist YouGov poll a couple of days ago where they asked Americans about mandatory mask wearing, and they asked them, should it be compulsory to wear a mask? 64% of white voters think it should be, 93% of black voters, 79% of Hispanic voters, 76% of women, even 44% of Republicans, and 71% of likely voters. And so on the kind of Trump and will he win, I think it's possible that he still wins, but I think it will be despite actions like the ones he took yesterday, not because of them.
And Zab, you've done a lot of work at Tortoise on ultra modern campaign techniques, private social networks and XR and so on. And I'm just interested in your insights into how you think this kind of grand theatricality will appeal, and how it will be playing in the kind of with general voters, but also with the deplorables, as Bannon calls them, with his base. Because what's clear is that Trump doesn't actually expect to win now, but he does want to lose by a sufficiently small margin that he can contest the election.
Yeah, well, I think for the deplorables, it will help a lot. But I think, as you've suggested there, it seems unlikely that will be enough. I think the idea that Trump commanding the news cycle means that he will perform better in the election is misguided. In fact, in 2016, there's a good book by a bunch of political scientists which showed that the more coverage Trump had in the news, actually the more negative his poll rating was. And in particular, in this election, where Trump's polling is kind of underwater, what he wants to be doing ideally is going on the attack on Biden. The Hillary Clinton email, October surprise, is a different October surprise to Trump being ill, because Hillary Clinton email, October surprise, allowed Trump to basically go on the attack. and Trump being ill is him on the defense, is taking the focus away from Biden. And so I think the theatre of yesterday is just an example of Trump not helping himself. I think, again, he might win despite the theatre, but I don't personally see much evidence that it's going to help his campaign in general for him to, rip his mask off and then go walking into the White House without his mask.
Thanks, Zav. Could we go? Lucy Huberman mentioned in the chat a documentary I happened to watch myself over the weekend, which completely startled me with its findings, and obviously interested you too, Lucy. Can you say a little bit about it, because it opened up for me a whole new sort of insight into how micro-targeting can work in the American electoral system.
Okay, well, I think if you watched it, you can probably help me out. I watched it because
it's called People You May Know.
Yeah, and I put the correct link.
Yes,
there are several films of that title. It can only be seen on Amazon Prime. They're having immense problems distributing it because it is so political, and I'm quite surprised it's still up on Amazon.
It's on Apple as well, which is
it? Okay, yeah. That's good. So I watched it because I remember Dr. Charles Creel from his role in the DCMS Select Committee on Fake News. So he was hired to help parliamentarians ask the right questions of people like Alexander Nix when they were investigating Cambridge Analytica. And it's fascinating because the film starts with him saying that while they were all listening intently to what Alexander Nix was saying, nobody picked up on the fact that when they talked about data and targeting, Alexander Nix mentioned churches. And in America, obviously, the churches ranging from, fairly sort of central, normal Christian churches through to the evangelical right and the mega churches are very influential. They have many followers, and they're probably, I don't know, Matthew, they're probably all Trump supporters, or most of them. So this is not about voter suppression. This is about how certain Republicans got super organized and sort of wormed their way into, well, they didn't have to worm very hard, their way into relationships with all of the different churches and the pastors. And they organized local data, the churches organized local databases, and somehow there's a missing link, Matthew, you might remember, that they got merged or alongside the Republicans' own Trump database. And they're not just obviously promoting voting because they're all quite avid Trump supporters already. They are working to advocate a sort of version of a future America that is sort of fairly born again. I mean, one of the Charles Creel's fiance, I think, was the reporter who went into the church and saw they had this timeline up on the wall that told each follower how many days they had left to make sure their children were Christian enough before they were 18. And so the film sort of reveals phenomenal organizational skills, but also financial links, Mike Pence's involvement in all of this. And I think the data piece was all organized by SCL, which was the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. And it showed really, that the micro-targeting you may be familiar with from 2016, that Channel 4 has been talking about, and that, also may have had some role in our own Brexit elections and the 2019 elections here, is alive and kicking today.
I think that's absolutely fascinating and true. And I think that the only point I'd add from the film this is that what was interesting was that what churches have and businesses crave is strong relationships. And of course, most churches at a minimum have a name and an address for their congregants. And of course, in American churches, the congregants at a church can be numbered in the thousands rather than in the scores. And the point that was made was once you can mesh up the information you get from a church to the point where you have social information scraped from social media and other sources about these people. You have at your fingertips an extraordinary resource, because you can identify people who are strong believers, who can then in turn identify other strong believers, and who are more likely to become activists or persuaders or so on. And I just think it was a very interesting insight into the sort of the entirely new landscape of democracy that's emerging.
Yeah, and it also focused on vulnerable people. So the church has a relationship with a lot of people, and it used its sort of army of believers to hook in all sorts of other people, as you say, who may, even students, so university campus Christian students used to spot students who turn up on campus who may feel a bit lost, who have left their families behind, who may not be totally social and can't bear. There was one example of a young woman who was quite Christian. She couldn't bear the thought of Freshers' Week and all that horrible socializing she had to do. So she went to a sort of churchy group, and she got activated, and she spilled the beans later on. So it's very, very granular and very, very targeted.
It's to a point where I think that one has to just hedge all predictions with the knowledge that this is going on at a level of detail that is impossible to track in real time.
It says it's radicalization. Sorry, that is just,
yes, that's right.
That is what came out in the film when one of the researchers, I can't remember if it was a guy in Australia, they had some really good open data, and other researchers obviously working on the data sources. He said, I didn't really take it seriously till I understand the sort of grooming techniques they were using were the same used by people wanting to radicalize for ISIS.
Preying on the vulnerable. Can we go to William Jeremy, who's been very patiently waiting? William, are you there? Hi, William. Can't hear.
Yeah.
There
Can you hear?
Hi.
Yeah. Just wanted to inject a note of possible upbeat optimism, in the sense that a United States polity that can elect Trump could also has also elected Obama, and might see the election of Biden as a way of eventually putting someone like Kamala Harris on the presidential ticket. And if the Republicans over a period of, I don't know, 5-10 years can renew themselves, then we could get to a chance of renewing the Republic with a capital R. And so we can have once again the potential to rebuild the shining city on the hill, as it were. Is that hopelessly, deludedly naive? Or is it something that we should be explicit about wanting in the wider world, if that makes sense?
Well, I certainly think you have to assume that if you live in a volatile world, you may as well take advantage of that volatility. And I agree. It's not, you know, what's interesting is how many people who voted for Obama voted for Trump, which suggests right. there is a kind of yearning for a change narrative, but almost any kind. I'd like to come back to Dave to ask some, again, to kind of shamelessly mine his knowledge, which is, I mean, you know, if you were in Washington now, Dave, you'd be, I imagine, preparing for something, a contested election that made 2000 look like a picnic. And I just wondered what, you know, given that Trump said in the debate that he would, without any qualification, that he would contest the result in the Supreme Court. What are the tripwires in this? let's assume, for the sake of argument, as a premise, that Biden doesn't win by such an overwhelming margin that any contest just looks ridiculous. What would Trump be doing? What's going on? How is Trump gaming his November?
Yeah, you see reports of lawyers having already been sort of put in position at county level in key states, where they're going to presumably be on deck to contest which votes are not being counted and why. I mean, if we all remember Florida and hanging chads and butterfly votes there that where people had felt they'd voted for one candidate but ended up, because of the way things were laid out, apparently voting for someone else. And you can see that there are just massive contradictions in what is going to be allowed. Will votes that are stamped with a date before election day but don't arrive until after the 9th of November, are they going to be counted or not? These are going to be fought over in the courts. And I think what we saw in 2000 was that you had tremendously partisan courts in Florida, who actually had sort of election officials in positions of power who were being able to make rulings that then informed what happened further up the chain at the Supreme Court. So there's no wonder that that Trump and Mitch McConnell want to get their pick onto the Supreme Court so that they've got a balance of power there. So yeah, you certainly could see it being fought out locally, then fought out at state level, and then going up to Supreme Court, which could, perhaps following that model could take a month. I think Hillary Clinton was very clearly sort of publicly saying to Biden, don't concede on the night, whatever you do. And I think that that's right, that unless it's an overwhelming margin, no one's going to try and no one's going to throw in the towel on the night.
But I mean, in 2000, it seemed like this was the most extraordinary thing ever, didn't it? It was like, you couldn't believe it, and the level of detail, and as you say, the hanging chads. The sense is that there's the smell of sulfur in the air here, I think.
That's right. I interviewed Al Gore in about, it was about 2013. So 13 years later, he'd moved on to An Inconvenient Truth by then. But it was still seared on him, and he said, I fought to the maximum extent that the law would allow. And what was I to do next? Take it to the streets? And he repeated it. He said, the streets, as if the idea that you might end up with civil war. And he bowed out when the Supreme Court declared. But you cannot see, you just can't see that in play now, can you? And I think people genuinely are anxious that, we've seen a lot of weaponry on display in the last few months with racial justice being contested, and it is very worrying, I think, what happens next, and the whole sort of stand-by language of Trump.
I was going to say, when you heard that, did you read it? Because I know that a few of us were watching it live, which tells you everything you need to know about our fixation with all this.
Sorry,
no, I know, I'm guilty. But when you heard "stand back" and "stand by," did you read it as just Trump talking rubbish, or did you actually read it as how it was taken by the Proud Boys and other white militia groups as a retreat, but get ready to take action order?
I feel like I've used a lot of my brain power trying to bring critical faculties to bear on decoding Trump, and I learned so in the middle of 2017 that it was a very foolish thing to do. Sometimes you need to step back. So I don't know. I don't know whether he meant it, but it's obvious that it has those connotations and that it can be read in that way and has been read in that way.
But it became a T-shirt within 12 hours, didn't it?
Yeah, exactly,
And
exactly right. Exactly.
And they didn't go out of their
So
way
I
to deny it.
whether or not he intended to say it in that way, it has that effect, and I think it's galvanizing for, yeah, it's galvanizing for people, no doubt. And you know, we've seen from you know, QAnon supporters going to, you know, Comet Ping Pong and trying to and shooting up a bloody pizza place. We've seen it in you know, more than one city in the last couple of months. You know that some people are going to be inspired to take their weapons out onto the streets.
Thank you very much, Dave. We're drawing towards the end of the hour, and there's so much one could pull together from that. You know, I think, as Dave said, that there is a sort of qualitative difference in this contest between almost any other contest before, except possibly 2016. But even that one can't compare it to, because we've seen what Trump is like now, and so baked into his share price is at least a degree of knowledge of what he was like as president. And I do think that must have a bearing upon how we look at the polls. And it's clear now, again, as Dave said, that, you know, this is going to be an election about COVID. Interestingly, I noted our co-founder Katie Bannock-Smith saying that, you know, that there is a chance that if Trump were able to bring this into under control before November the 3rd, he wins. And I think that's so, in the sense that, you know, if he were to persuade the American public that he had managed not only personally but nationally to beat the virus, whether that was so or not, then that would be, you know, a path to victory. On the other hand, that's a huge ask in the remaining days. Very interested too in what Chris had to say about the continued erosion of media trust. And, you know, we alluded several times to the conspiracy theories that have become just commonplace and were an instantaneous response to Trump's health crisis. And obviously this, entertaining as it may be, is a way of, erodes trust in democratic and electoral processes, and in a way that traditionally has benefited populist insurgent movements. So there is clearly a structural problem. You know, Tortoise has tried very hard to be part of that, but it's a global problem too. I was fascinated by some of the statistics Zav had at his fingertips, which I think really put the whole thing into you know, some perspective, and does suggest that there is a measure of, if not certainty, then certainly clear trajectory at this time that hasn't been, that certainly wasn't to the same extent in 2016. Nonetheless, you know, one has to look at the question that both Lucy and Guterres in their different ways raised, which is that this is a new kind of electoral landscape in which micro-targeting goes on, in which churches, organizations like the Lincoln Project can have you know, an extraordinary impact, and we await with a mixture of trepidation and expectation to November the 3rd to see what happens. You know, to conclude on a happy note, it was good to hear from Ella that, if nothing else, we've learned a little bit from all the drugs that have been fired into Trump's body in the last few days, just how far we've progressed in treating COVID. And I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind, and a grounds for measured optimism as we enter this second wave, that though without question there is going to be a wave of hospital admissions in the UK in the next couple of weeks and beyond, that it's possible that with the clinical improvements that have been made since March and April, one hopes that the level of fatalities will be considerably lower. So that would be an unexpected blessing of the of this extraordinary weekend. There is a long way to go still in political terms before November the 3rd. The vice presidential debate on Thursday between Pence and Harris will be unusually interesting for obvious reasons. And I hope you'll all join us in the other events which we will be doing about the debate. I know Dave is going to be hosting at least one. Do sign up to the SenseMaker, by the way, which is going to be, as ever, your vital guide to this and everything else in the coming period. And thank you all very much for taking part, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.